If your memory hasn't felt as sharp as it should, or you're finding it harder to stay focused and retain information, it's easy to kind of brush it off and assume that it's just one of those days. Maybe you're a bit tired, you've got a lot going on, but in many cases, that's not actually the problem. What's usually happening is much more simple. Your brain isn't being given the conditions it needs to effectively build and retain memory. And one of the most effective ways to change that is through movement. Now, if you've ever felt like things just aren't sticking, your focus drops off, or you're not performing at the level that you know that you're capable of, it's very easy to look for better strategies, better ways to learn, better systems, better productivity tools and all that kind of stuff. And those things can really help, but they're not the main driver, because memory isn't just about strategy. It's about the condition of the brain doing the learning. In over 20 years of coaching, I've seen this again and again. People who are intelligent, driven, ambitious, but they're frustrated because their brain just doesn't seem to keep up. They forget things, they lose track of ideas, they read something and forget it almost immediately. And they assume that the problem is their memory, but it's often not a memory problem in the way that you might think. More often than not, it's a capacity problem. The brain simply isn't being supported well enough to take in, process, and retain information. Your brain's ability to take in, process, and retain information is directly linked to how well it's been supported physically. So your energy, your blood flow, your internal chemistry, stress regulation, if those things aren't in place, your brain will always feel like it's kind of not performing to its potential. When you exercise, your body releases a protein called BDNF, which stands for brain-derived neurotrophic factor. Now, that's a bit of a mouthful and it sounds quite complicated, but the idea is fairly simple. You can think of it as like fertilizer for your brain, and it supports the growth, survival, and strengthening of connections between brain cells. And this is the most part people don't really realize, because for a long time, we thought that the brain stopped developing in adulthood, early 20s, but we now know that that isn't true. Your brain remains capable of change throughout life. It's constantly adapting, constantly rewiring itself based on your environment and what you do. And exercise is one of the strongest signals you can give it. So memory isn't fixed, it's something you're either supporting or neglecting. But for any of that to actually happen, your brain needs energy, not just for growth and adaptation, but for everything it does. Your brain is incredibly energy demanding. Even though it's pretty small, around 2% of your total body weight, it uses about 20% of your daily energy requirements. So if your energy systems aren't functioning well, your focus drops, your memory becomes less reliable, and just general thinking kind of feels harder than it should. And the reason for that sits at a very basic level inside your cells. So inside your cells, you have structures called mitochondria, and you can think of them as little tiny energy generators. Essentially, what they do is they take the fuel that you consume and convert it into usable energy. But when you train consistently, you increase both the number and efficiency of these mitochondria. So now your brain just isn't struggling to keep up. It has the energy it needs to support attention, learning, memory. So you're not just trying to concentrate harder, force yourself to concentrate. You actually have the capacity to do it. But there's another layer to this as well. When your muscles contract during exercise, they release these tiny molecules called myokines, and they travel up through the bloodstream to the brain. So, your muscles aren't just moving your body around. They're actively communicating with your brain. And some of these myokines, they help increase BDNF, neuroplasticity, and support how your brain cells function. So every time you train, you're not just working on strength and fitness and all that kind of stuff. You're sending chemical signals to your brain that support memory, learning, and overall cognitive performance. And this is why movement is so powerful. It's not just mechanical, it's biochemical. But even with all that kind of cool sciencey stuff going on, your brain still needs a constant supply of good old-fashioned oxygen and nutrients to perform properly. And you'll feel this almost immediately when you move. There's a real physical shift in what's happening in your brain. You'll feel clearer, more focused, more switched on. And the reason for that is simple. When you move, you increase blood flow to the brain, which means more oxygen and more nutrients are being delivered to the areas responsible for focus and memory. So in real time, you're improving the environment your brain is operating in. You're not just forcing your brain to work better, because we know that that doesn't work. but you're giving it what it needs to work properly. And once that physical side is in place, you start to see real changes in how your brain actually functions and performs. And one of the ways that this shows up is through changes in your brain's chemistry. So we know that exercise influences neurotransmitters like dopamine, serotonin, and noradrenaline. And these affect things like attention, motivation, and mood. So now you're not just improving memory directly, you're improving the state your brain is whilst you're trying to learn. And I think that's often a big missing piece. So when you step back and look at all of this together, a very different picture starts to emerge. Because a lot of people are trying to think better or simply work harder, when in reality, they need to support the system that allows them to think well in the first place. So what does this actually look like in practice? What does it mean for you? Well, I think this is where a lot of people can get it wrong, because they either do too little or they try and do everything at once. But what you actually need is the right type of input at the right time for the right outcome, because different types of training support different aspects of brain function. So if your goal is focus and mental clarity, low to moderate intensity aerobic work is one of the most effective tools that you have. So something like zone 2 cardio improves blood flow, supports mitochondrial function, and creates a more stable energy supply to your brain. If your goal is learning and memory, then you want to create the conditions for neuroplasticity, and that's where resistance training becomes so useful and valuable, because it stimulates BDNF, myokine release, and a range of other processes that support how your brain adapts and retains information. And then you have higher intensity work like HIIT, and used properly, this can increase things like dopamine, noradrenaline, which are directly linked to alertness, motivation, and cognitive drive. But the key isn't just what you do, it's when you do it. You know, if you've got a deep work session or an important meeting or something that requires high cognitive output, even just 10-20 minutes of movement beforehand can significantly improve how your brain performs. But it's not just what you do, it's when you do it. You know, if you've got a deep work session or an important meeting or something that requires high cognitive output, even just 10-20 minutes of movement beforehand can significantly improve how your brain performs. And this is exactly how I approach it with my clients. You know, when I design a program, I'm not just thinking about physical health or aesthetics. I'm also looking at their current stress levels, if they've been traveling recently, especially flying, you know, what their work actually demands from them and how they use their brain on a day-to-day basis. And also we'll look at when they need to be at their best. You know, perhaps they've got a big presentation at the end of the week or a meeting, because once you understand that, you can start to align training and performance, not just fitness. And this is the most important thing that people miss. They separate exercise from thinking, when in reality, the two are, you know, they're deeply connected. So instead of asking, when do I fit training into my day? A better question might be, what does my brain need today and how do I support that? So if your memory hasn't felt as sharp as it should, don't jump straight to the conclusion that something's wrong. You know, in many cases, it's not a limitation, it's just a lack of support. When people are working really hard, I don't tell them to slow down. I help them build a body and a brain that can actually handle the level that they're trying to perform at. And if you want to understand where your own system might be under supported, I'll put together a short cognitive assessment and I'll link that below.